Hi, everybody. Welcome to join Managing Fraud in Retrofit Masterclass. I am Tiffany Pang, a junior consultant from Turner & Townsend. We are joined today by Lisa Groves and Gemma Howland from Ricardo. This is a retrofit information support and expertise event, which is fully funded by the Department of Energy Security and Net Zero and delivered by Turner & Townsend. So now I will hand over to Lisa and Gemma for today's presentation.
Thanks, Tiffany. Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Lisa Groves and I'm a technical director at Ricardo. You may have heard of Ricardo from SHDF Demo and Wave 1, but if not, we're an environmental consultancy with a 30-year history of running large programmes for the UK government. I've personally designed and managed over £1.2 billion worth of funding programmes in the low carbon sector over the last 16 years. And the session today brings together our advice and guidance on best practice in managing fraud within grant schemes, specifically considering key risk areas when it comes to retrofit projects under the Warm Homes programmes. I'll pass you over to my colleague Gemma to introduce herself.
Thank you, Lisa. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this afternoon session. So I've been working at Ricardo for over 25 years, and my area of expertise is on grant-funded programmes, very much like Lisa. Lisa and I have designed many QA processes to check claims for fraud and error on grant-funded programmes. Next slide, please.
Okay, so in the session today, we'll cover the importance of fraud prevention and also the difference between fraud and error and why both of those matter. We'll move on then to the key components of effective fraud management plans and compliance requirements for the Warm Homes programmes, noting that this is a high-level overview and you'll have more detailed guidance issued directly via DESNZ. And we'll then cover some of the key risks for fraud and error in retrofit supply chains and claiming for grants. We'll cover some advice around implementing a risk-based audit scheme. And finally, we'll cover some top tips to strengthen your fraud identification processes. So, Gemma, can I hand over to you, please, for the importance of fraud prevention?
Thank you. So why is it important to manage fraud and error? So fraud and error impacts are wide-ranging and they can affect us as individuals, organisations and public services, just to name a few. It is a significant issue in the public sector, and in March 2024 it was estimated to have cost the government between £33 and £59 billion. Fraud and error can compromise the government's ability to deliver the services and achieve the intended outcomes. Some common types of fraud against the UK government are, of course, benefit and tax evasion. And we as individuals, we can experience fraud, and it accounts for over 40% of crime in England and Wales. And the most common type of fraud that we may have experienced ourselves is bank and credit card fraud. Government-funded schemes, we have social targets. For example, one of the aims on the Warm Homes local grant is to support low-income households. Money going to fraudulently to applicants prevent those most in need of actually getting the support. Government-funded schemes have environmental targets, and again, improper use of funds risks meeting these targets. The Warm Home scheme is working so very hard to ensure that homes meet EPCC by 2030 in line with the government's net zero targets. What is the difference between fraud and error? So on this slide here, we do have two very formal definitions, but just in essence, fraud is something that is intentional, it's dishonest, and it does cause financial loss to another person with the intent of making financial gain for themselves. So error is often, it's accidental, it's unintentional, and it just might arise from negligence or actually just general misunderstanding of how to follow a process or a failure in terms of QA. Next slide, please. So the law before the Fraud Act was introduced was really unhelpful in terms of dealing with fraud, theft and deception, because it was just too broad, it was complicated, and it was really outdated and really failed to address the modern types of fraud that we have today. So in 2006, a new act was designed, and that was to make understanding fraud much easier for us to understand. And this includes false representation, fraud by abuse of position, and fraud by disclosing information. So on this slide, we have a couple of examples. So under false representation, an example might be that the supplier provides false information in support of a claim. So they might be doing false receipts, they might claim for travel or accommodation, which didn't actually take place, or they may actually add to the payroll staff that do not exist. So fraud by abuse of power, an example might be that a member of staff leaks information about an upcoming opportunity to a potential supplier for whom that they might have a personal link, for example, a family member. And this might be someone who's working in procurement, finance, or commercial, for example, that might actually disclose this sensitive information to a supplier. Fraud by failing to disclose information. A supplier may fail to disclose information which may exclude or prevent them for the contract actually being placed. For example, they might have unspent criminal convictions, or they might actually be disqualified as a company director. Next slide. So in terms of types of error, so there's two main types. There's internal, which is a mistake or negligence that occurs within an internal process. For example, that might be having paperwork signed off by the incorrect level of authority within your organisation, or quality checks fail to notice a decimal point in the wrong place on a timesheet. An external error, that might be an error or mistake which was again unintentionally by a third party or process. For example, a supplier may mistakenly charge twice for the same piece of work, and that could be due to inaccurate record keeping. Errors can often be resolved, but it's really important, for example, that your project manager will oversee the measure to avoid a similar incident happening again. And it may be that there needs to be some training, reminders of staff, looking at your policies, updating your QA guidance, and really just raising awareness amongst your team on the lessons learned from that error. Lisa is going to talk a little bit more later on in the presentation about some top tips.
Thanks, Gemma. We're going to talk now through creating a proactive fraud management plan. We'll touch on later in the compliance slides. A fraud management plan is a key component of managing fraud alongside a fraud risk assessment. RISE are going to run some future sessions on more detailed masterclasses on writing fraud risk assessments, as they're a fundamental part of the approach. And there's a flow to the guidance that you'll have been issued under the Warm Homes programmes that starts with identifying the risks and assessing the related controls in the fraud risk assessment, and then using the fraud management plan to set out how those controls are going to be managed, potential fraud and error identified, investigated and resolved. So in creating a proactive fraud management plan, there's 5 key areas to consider. Those are governance, stakeholders, potential routes of fraud, controls, although as noted for Warm Homes, these are addressed in the fraud risk assessment, and finally escalation and reporting. Right, looking firstly at governance and governance structures, think about who will have overall responsibility and accountability within your organisation. How regularly will the plan and the associated risk assessment be reviewed, and by whom? Consider which stakeholders are going to be involved in fraud management, and that can include contract managers, your finance team, any auditors or team members undertaking compliance checks, and crucially, team members undertaking QA roles. In mapping out potential routes of fraud, consider the whole project ecosystem, including the in-house delivery teams and those outside the direct project delivery team, for example, your commercial teams or your finance teams and legal teams. Think about contractors within your supply chain. That can include installers, surveyors, marketing and external data services, and also residents. We'll pick up on a particular theme of resident eligibility fraud under the local grant scheme as we go through the session today, so you'll see that come through. Set out your controls for managing fraud. A good approach is to use lines of defence against fraud and error, using subcontracted installers here as an example. So the first line of defence would be to have well-defined contracts for your suppliers and make sure they set out expectations for reporting and evidence requirements. Make sure the contract T's and C's include provision for fraud identification and the implications if fraud is identified. The second line of defence would be to undertake thorough due diligence of awarded suppliers, including their past performance, their own processes and procedures for managing fraud within their operations, and any previous history of legal proceedings. The third line of defence would be to have clear procedures and checklists within the project delivery team and finance team to review submitted invoices and supporting evidence. And the fourth line of defence would be to implement a risk-based audit scheme to verify work's been undertaken as required. And we'll come on to some more specifics on how to do this later in the session. Finally, a strong fraud management plan will have clear fraud escalation and reporting processes that's designed to be used at any point in project delivery. This should cover communication channels, including routes for escalating suspected fraud and whistleblowing hotlines for all parties. Details of your fraud investigation processes, including case triage, evidence gathering, and outcome determination. How appeals against decisions are going to be managed. What sanctions will be taken where decisions are upheld or not challenged. And finally, how debt will be recovered and prosecutions pursued if appropriate. So there's a lot of things to cover under a fraud management plan. But there's some guidance that's been issued by DESNZ that you should use when you're developing both your fraud risk assessments and fraud management plans. So I encourage you to read that in detail. In compliance with the Warm Home Scheme, DESNZ requires grant recipients to adopt a proactive, structured and targeted approach to managing the risk of fraud, error and other non-compliance. Guidance has already been issued to grant recipients detailing those specific requirements. Under the Warm Home Schemes, the guidance requires grant recipients to develop and submit a fraud risk assessment and a fraud management plan in the early stages of your project. This allows DESNZ to ensure that grant recipients have understood the risks and have appropriate measures in place to manage those risks. It also allows DESNZ to target support to build capability where needed. For the Social Housing Fund Challenge Fund projects, the fraud risk assessment and fraud management plan must be submitted with the first phase request. For strategic partnership projects under the Social Housing Fund, these must be submitted with the signed grant funding agreement before the project starts. And for the local grant scheme, grant recipients are expected to provide an outline fraud management plan prior to your mid-mobilisation review, with a full plan submitted as part of the delivery confidence assessment processes. So it's really important to follow the guidance closely when producing those outputs. You also need to update your fraud risk assessment monthly from the start of the project. As a part of project setup, you'll also receive a data sharing agreement, which will provide further information on the data you'll be required to gather, track and share with DESNZ to mitigate fraud, funding duplication and other non-compliance. You'll be given access to a fraud and error tool called the Checker to support those activities once the data sharing agreement has been signed. Reporting on identified fraud and error contributes to a programme level measurement of losses and monitoring the performance of the controls put in place. It also helps the build the threat picture across the schemes and gives us a really good overview of where the key emerging trends are coming from. Based on our experience of fraud and error reporting to DESNZ over multiple schemes in the last 5 years, reporting data is likely to include the fraud and error category, so whether it's detected fraud, recovered fraud, prevented fraud, an external error or an internal error. We need to cover the value of the fraud or error and provide a description of the fraud or error, the date that the fraud or error was committed and the date it was detected. Who committed the fraud or error? Was it, for example, the homeowner or landlord, installer, or even the grant administrator, particularly in the area of error? How the fraud or error was detected, and any actions taken to resolve that fraud or error, including debt recovery if appropriate. And finally, any resulting changes that you've made as part of lessons learned to your processes or your controls, or any further recommendations that you would be making internally or within your supply chain, or indeed recommendations to DESNZ at a programme level. I'll pass over back to Gemma to cover the key fraud and error risks in retrofit supply chains.
Thank you, Lisa. So in the next few slides, I'm covering some of the more generic key areas of risk in the supply chain. But just to echo Lisa's point earlier, that it's really important that grant recipients refer to the guidance that they'll specifically receive from DESNZ. So in every aspect of our lives, from personal endeavours to professional pursuits, mistakes are inevitable of being human. However, when it comes to the workplace, the cost of human error can be significant. Unfortunately, I've seen lots of errors made during the claim process over the last 25 years. And I'm not embarrassed to admit that I've made a few mistakes as well. But pleased to say that in terms of identifying or seeing cases of fraud, they are few and far between. But that doesn't mean that we should not be vigilant, because it is really important. The largest areas of risk will be highlighted over the next couple of slides, and later Lisa will give you some top tips on how to spot these. I'll not read every bullet point here today, but just pull out a few of them. So under cost calculation, there may be an order placed for overseas goods and services, and the rate used for the foreign currency conversion may be incorrect, and may mean that there's an overinflation or in fact an underpayment when it's reimbursed in pounds. Under ineligible or unsupported claims, suppliers charging for work which took place before the actual contract start date, and charging for elements which were not actually agreed in the scope of work, something to be really vigilant of. Under evidence documentation, there might be poorly completed expenditure breakdowns. I mean, even myself, I've had a recent example where I've seen an invoice from a supplier stating that 30% of the work was eligible for payment and the remainder was part of a different project. And they've struggled to explain how the 30% was calculated in the first instance. So really important to have some due diligence on looking at the descriptions. Next slide, please. So on-site installs, with a market for retrofitting increasing significantly, some suppliers may use unqualified staff, and this in fact will have large but it may in fact even null and void your guarantee or your warranty. So really important to check that you have qualified members of staff. Under labour, to account for labour, especially on time and materials contracts, it's really important to have a proper timesheet recording process in place from the onset. Otherwise, it could lead to errors and disputes and possibly fraud. For claim management, it's very common to have claims delayed as suppliers weren't actually geared up to provide you with the correct evidence. And when the evidence is supplied, you may in fact receive duplicates or even information that's not related to your project to support your claim. I think I'm now handing back to you.
Thank you very much, Gemma. So I'm now going to cover implementing a risk-based audit scheme. These are really, really key to have within any grant funding situation, maybe far more applicable as well, right across your supply chain in terms of what you want to set up and how. So this is a sort of high level view, but we've tried to revise it as closely as possible to retrofit projects. So when considering your approach to implementing a risk-based audit scheme, you need to think about the different types of audit. Firstly, they can be desk-based, So detailed evidence is therefore requested and reviewed, which can often include a recorded Teams meeting where screens are shared showing financial or invoicing details, or they can be a physical on-site visit. And the purpose of those can either be to visually confirm the measures installed, any quality checks to confirm compliance with installation standards, or they can be that in-person check of financial and invoicing systems on-site offices of the supply chain. Other factors to consider are the scale and the frequency of audit. So in terms of scale, thinking about how detailed do you need to go? Do you need to go and visit the office, the head office, and ask to view their timesheeting system, their invoicing system, confirmation that they have receipted payments to their own subcontractors and the evidence that they've paid the money out? Do you want to check at that level? Or are you happy to receive a desk-based level of audit where they send the evidence to you? And think about the frequency of audit. How often do you need to be going out there, or how often do you need to be requesting these evidence checks? And we'll talk in the next slide about some of the risk factors that will inform that decision. But the risks that are specific to the project inform your view of what's proportionate and help you make your plan for your risk-based audit scheme. So in order to get a clearer picture of what's proportional, it's important to assess the risk factors that would increase the potential for fraud and error as well. For example, where you have a new supplier that you've not worked with before, that can really increase the risk of fraud and error. They won't be familiar with your systems or your requirements for data evidence. And you aren't familiar with them either. You don't know their track record. You don't have a past history of how reliable, how on time they are with producing evidence, how clear they are on their invoicing, how timely they are in responding to requests for audit as well. So that does raise the risk factor quite significantly if it's a brand new supplier that you haven't worked with before. Also consider the degree of scale up in size of management or installation contract compared to previous contracts that they've undertaken either for you or for other buyers. Right across the social housing, retrofit and local grant scheme, contractors are getting on board and building up their portfolio of work. And we saw a real step change in the scale from some of the earlier demonstrator and wave one projects in terms of scale of programme to be delivered. And that obviously resulted in a follow-on impact in the scale of the contracts that were being issued within the supply chain. And it's really important to recognise the upscaling and risk when you move from a contract into a whole different scale of delivery over a longer time scale. It does bring new risks into what could be an already existing supplier with quite a trusted relationship. Also think about the number of different contracts that you've placed within your supply chain, particularly if a supplier is going to further subcontract elements of the work. So the more complex the supply chain, the more contracts that are placed within it, the higher the risks become. And really think about, are you centrally, as the grant recipient, placing multiple contracts across lots and lots of different suppliers? Or are you contracting out to one managing agent who is then going to further subcontract? And where do the risks lie between internal checking risks and actually fraud management and checking within that single large supply contract to a management company? So really think about where in that supply chain the risks sit. Think about the experience of the individuals that are going to be responsible for detecting fraud, both within your internal team and if you've subcontracted a retrofit coordinator, they will be a key part of this process in terms of checking that what's been installed is compliant with the programme and with what the contracts have actually set out. So the lesser experienced individuals could be overseen or quality assured more closely than perhaps more experienced individuals, but it's also really important to always consider QA processes just to catch particularly errors in following processes, but do consider the experience of the actual individuals in your team as part of assessing the risk factors in your project. And finally, think about the market demand from competing local and national retrofit projects for similar materials, products, labour resources, contractors. Again, with this scaling up of the Warm Homes programmes from its sort of more humble beginnings a few years ago, and we're really seeing lots and lots of new market entrants. And if there's competing demands for resource, it really does increase the risk that some characters out there will sell the same products twice to two different organisations, or they will be making up people on the books in terms of timesheets because they don't actually have the resources because they've overstretched themselves. So really important to consider the actual market demand and who else is out there trying to procure the same services from a relatively limited pool in terms of the degree of scale up of some of these projects. Then looking to actually implement a risk-based audit scheme, within your controls, you need to set out your proposed audit sample size, the type of audit, noting the sort of scale of it, whether it's desk-based, whether it's a physical audit, what will be covered in those audits, to what depth and what degree, what evidence would be required to complete that audit, and what frequency are you going to undertake the audits, and along with your rationale for that within your controls. So consider auditing the first invoice or the first batch of installations from any new supplier. I think that's gold standard. Don't ignore that one. Do always consider auditing the very first invoice of the first batch of installations. And where the risk factors that we discussed on the previous slide are pretty high, reflect that in your sample size and your planned audit frequency, particularly where you might have suspicions that fraud might take place from a particular supplier or a particular sort of hot area of risk, particularly around labour. That's where we have seen some instances of fraud, again, primarily driven by organisations overstretching themselves in what they commit to across multiple different contracts. So where you feel that may be a higher risk for your particular project, do set out an increased frequency of audits. And finally, don't forget to include the requirement to comply with those audit requests in your contracts with your suppliers. It's amazing how many times you can see an organisation wanting to audit their supply chain, and actually there's quite strong pushback around not being able to have someone on site, or that unfortunately there's nobody available. And actually, if you get that in there in your terms and conditions, the requirement to comply with audit requests and set out what those audits may cover, it just gives you that safety and that security that that's really, really clear, and there shouldn't be any pushback from your supply chain in undertaking those audits. So finally, I'll cover some top tips to strengthen fraud identification. I'll touch on some behaviours, I'll touch on particularly invoices and timesheets, and then we'll look at the residential eligibility area for the local grant schemes, just being a particular area where we feel that there is a degree of risk introduced to the whole Warm Homes programme. So let's start with your role in spotting fraud and error. As a grant recipient, your role is really, really key within this programme. DESNZ expect fraud management to be handled in a systematic way, creating an auditable trail that supports any reported fraud and errors. Behaviours that are going to be really important here are firstly to start early. Consider all the factors that are going to be necessary to pay your suppliers' invoices with confidence in what's being delivered. As I'd said earlier in the session, think about what's going to be required from them right up front, right at the point that you're contracting them, and get that into the contract as a written requirement. So they've set up the systems, processes and tools in order to provide that data for you. There's nothing worse than trying to audit a supplier, particularly auditing their timesheet evidence, when they turn around and say, we don't do timesheets. So what do you want to audit? We just write some numbers down to put on our invoices. Or all our staff are just full-time employees, and that's that. So very, very difficult to audit and unpick or uncover any fraud within that if you've not set out in your original contract what you're expecting, what your requirements are, to be able to verify for yourselves what evidence has been supplied. Ask questions, be curious. If something isn't clear to you, ask a question about it and be really clear in your communications. Picking up on the example that Gemma gave of the invoice that had been submitted with a vague 30% of the costs were going to be covered or claimed against the project and 70% were for something else. I think previously to that same organisation had taken that approach on a different funding programme, and that had all been tickety-boo. But it's not so in programmes with robust fraud and error checking plans. So you really need to ask those questions and sort of scratch the surface if something doesn't quite seem clear or fully justified. That can be often where you do identify the fraud, because they've intentionally put something in that isn't clear in order to try and get away with putting in a fraudulent invoice. Be really systematic and be patient. Fraud isn't usually really obvious, so it can take time to investigate, and it's absolutely fine to flag up potential fraud, suspected fraud, and follow the investigation process that you've set out in your fraud management plan. Nobody will get in trouble for investigating potential fraud, and if you find there isn't fraud, that's a positive and good outcome, and you can contribute really actively to lessons learned around that. The worst case scenario is running out of time to check something, signing it off because you've just run out of time or are under pressure, and actually later checks then reveal that the fraudulent activity has taken place and it's not been picked up. And finally, make use of checklists and templates. They are a really, really important tool in what your role covers. So take a centralised and really consistent approach, and that supports staff changeovers, covering for absences, for example. If you're really clear and consistent in your record keeping of what has been checked, what the processes are, particularly around fraud identification and investigation, then if somebody is off ill, for example, or if a new member of team comes in, they can pick right up in that process and take the next steps. Whereas if it isn't clear and people are just doing things off their own internal checklists, almost impossible to pass that over to somebody else if you're taken ill. Okay, some top tips around checking invoices now. Invoices may not just cover energy measures. So think of marketing, data, any other services you've used, as well as the sort of more prominent installation and supply services. Beware of receipts or invoices that have already been claimed and paid once. It's really, really easy for projects to put in a receipt or an invoice twice, whether accidentally or deliberately. That's a really common error that we spot, and it is typically an error rather than fraud. But I think what it speaks to is inaccurate record keeping, as Gemma pointed out in the sort of key risk areas. So not only does accurate record keeping need to be front and centre in your project management of your funded project, but also in the supply chain. As mentioned, one of the strongest ways to do that is make sure that the requirements for record keeping, for data provision, are clear in your contracting. Spot check by checking online for the supplier website and the company existence. For example, you could check on Companies House, and that could also help identify if there's any previous queries or issues with the company directors that flag up if it's already passed through your existing due diligence processes in onboarding new suppliers. But do spot check the invoices, particularly where you're seeing invoices further down within the supply chain, where work has been subcontracted and then potentially further subcontracted, and then something's been procured and purchased really, really deep within that supply chain. Those are the ones that, if fraud's going to occur, it's probably deeper within the supply chain. And so you're checking and auditing of your suppliers. Typically, you want to make sure that they are following the same processes around fraud management within their own supply chains. And it does go on and on until the end point where something has actually been secured and the service is delivered by somebody. But just be conscious of the fact that it can be multi-layered. Sense check invoices. I know Gemma flagged up the risk around materials being purchased in euros and then not converted to pounds. Similarly, you need to look at the date of those invoices and make sure that they tie up with the timescales that you were expecting in terms of what's been delivered. Check who the invoice was addressed to. Was it, if it's an invoice from a third party, has it been addressed to the correct contact details, addressed to the correct supplier? Is it the description accurate? Does it match exactly what you were expecting to have been delivered? Have a calculator to hand. Do keep checking the maths on the supporting documents. And if you're then yourself putting together a grant claim and pulling lots of different invoice values into a claim yourself, particularly on the social housing fund, make sure that the correct numbers are then carried through onto your grant claim. Time and time again, people rely on formulae in Excel, and they're not always indestructible. So do keep a check yourself of whether the totals tally across various sheets, particularly on more complex claims. It's very easy to miss, as Gemma noted, decimal points being in the wrong place, or miss out a line, or a formula hasn't quite captured the full length of the rows that are being covered in a table. Very, very easy errors to make and to miss as well when you're filling out grant claim forms. Look out for values that are always round numbers. Are they real or are they estimates? I'm always very suspicious of a round number. Don't particularly like a grant claim that comes in for a completely round error, a round number. So I would say always do look into that if you do get totally round numbers. Are people just estimating values rather than being specific and accurate? Finally, for large pieces of capital equipment, don't be afraid to ask for a photo of the delivered kit. If they were not supplied with the claim already, go and ask for a picture. If you're not going to be going out on site anytime soon, do ask for those details so that you can visually verify as well as possible that something has been installed. Look on the invoice description to see if the equipment has been purchased as well. Make sure there's no mention of leasing fees. If they're claiming for a capital product, they're claiming for an asset, it's really important that there's not a lease agreement within there that means actually that hasn't been purchased, it's just been leased. So important to recognise the difference between those and tally that up against what has been funded and against what the requirements are in your eligible costs for your programme. Okay, moving on to timesheets covering labour charges. This includes where you're claiming for internal team time, as well as if you've received labour charges from your supply chain. So it can look both ways. You could be utilising this advice to look at your own timesheets and labour contributions to a grant claim as you're putting that together, or equally, if you are reviewing the submitted invoices for a labour claim within your supply chain. So top tips here include checking enough information has been provided for you to recalculate that labour claim and get the same value. So again, really important upfront to make sure that the requirements, if this is coming through your supply chain, you've set out the requirements for the supporting evidence for a labour claim invoice. Are you going to require the number of days at each rate? Are you going to require the rates for each grade? And does that then tally up and total the labour claim? Do the days that each member of staff has worked actually look feasible for the period that invoice or your grant claim covers? Has one person, for example, delivered 50 days worth of work in the last 20 days? Really think about practically, is that a genuine number? You'll start getting used to seeing, obviously, full-time FTE type figures for people working on the project full-time, but also consider that people might be working part-time. And if full-time hours are being claimed, that's an important thing to be checking if something looks a little bit off. You might be under the understanding that the project manager from your supplier works part-time or is working on multiple projects at the same time, yet you're receiving an invoice on their timesheet that says they've worked on your project full-time 5 days a week, and that's not genuine. So that's a real area to pick up on. Are the number of days claimed always the same? So this is about thinking backwards and forwards between previous invoices that you've seen? Are you getting through what looks like exactly the same timesheet data every single time? And does that raise your suspicions? Unless it's a team of 5 people working full time and you know that they're working full time on your project, I would be very suspicious of a timesheet that comes through looking the same every single month that it gets submitted. So important to think back to what was submitted last time around and sense check that. And finally, are the day rates that they've put in there the same as those in either a quote to you originally or in the application that you put in for the grant funding? Or have they increased? Have things changed over time? And is there any rationale or justification for that? And do you need to have any variations approved within your grant paperwork to make sure that those day rates are actually okay to increase? So plenty of things to think about just on timesheets and invoicing. But I will pass on now to resident eligibility checks. We wanted to focus specifically and bring these into this session simply because it had been raised within the RISE team that this is a key area of risk across the Warm Homes programmes, say specifically around the local grant scheme. But when looking at resident eligibility, top tips here are to think about what documents you'd be needing to verify resident eligibility. These could be income related, they could be land registry or title deeds for the property. The next slide, I've got sort of details of the 3 different streams of eligibility. But as you'll be aware, if you're operating within the local grant scheme, it's quite a complex piece in terms of what are the routes in for eligibility, and therefore what are the associated documents going to be for each of those different pathways. Think about how you're going to verify those documents. Are you going to have 2 or more people doing checks of those documents? Really think through what is going to be a good structure as well on how to review those documents. What's acceptable, what's not acceptable, what would raise a bit of a red flag, or what would pass through fine and you can have full confidence in them. Think about the risks, identity fraud, forgery, outdated documents being submitted, that sort of years out of date, and therefore, if an updated or fresh document was submitted, would that render the applicant or the household ineligible? Think about setting up a fraud reporting hotline. It's really important within these schemes for all parties to be able to report to each other. Also, members of the public, if they are aware of fraud taking place and they know that somebody fraudulently applied to the scheme to benefit from it, it's really key to have a communication channel and a route for people to be able to report fraud. Think about how you're going to prevent your team or your contractor misapproving the eligibility. Again, this sort of goes back to point 2 around verifying. How many people are actually going to do those checks and at what level and within which organisation? Is a first check going to be done by a contractor and a second check done by yourselves? Really important to set that out really clearly. And then finally, what is the recovery process if you do discover fraudulent activity? What will you do? What will the investigation look like? How will you communicate that to the household that may have fraudulently applied to the scheme and claimed that they are eligible to be participants? Like I say, we've popped in a reminder slide here of the household eligibility pathways, just to highlight really the range of evidence that you may need to be reviewing for fraud and error under pathways 1, 2 and 3. It is important to note that the household only needs to meet the criteria of one of those pathways to be eligible, but it does emphasise the range of different documents that you may need to be reviewing. And like I say, have a view on which are the ones you can have full confidence in, which are the ones that may pose you more risk than others. And again, the guidance issued by DESNZ around creating your fraud risk assessment and your fraud management plan will give you more pointers on some of these real specifics within the individual schemes. We've got some key takeaways here that hopefully you've picked up from the session today. Firstly, fraud and error are very different issues, but they're both really important to manage. Errors are far more common, but fraud is far harder to detect. A strong fraud management plan and fraud risk assessment considers proactive strategies and controls for managing risk and preventing it. And there are risks of fraud and error throughout the supply chain and the grant claim process. However, preparation, diligence, and quality assurance actions reduce those risks quite significantly. And thorough fraud management can be really, really effective in delivering a successful project where reporting is really open, there's a clear line of communication and escalation on any issues that do occur, and you're able to then learn lessons and apply those lessons going forward in any future projects.
Thank you, everybody, for attending. Thank you, Gemma and Lisa, for today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.